But we begin in Iran. The country's notorious Evin Prison, where political prisoners are held captive, is on center stage today. Fire broke out at the facility yesterday, and the sounds of gunshots could be heard in the area. Now, Iranian officials claim that 4 people were killed and 61 others were injured. CBC's Dominic Velitis has more.
Footage posted on social media clearly shows flames and smoke rising from Evin Prison last night, and occasionally gunshots and explosions can be heard in the distance. Now, it's not clear exactly where that's coming from. It could be from inside the prison itself or even outside. We just don't know. It's impossible for us to verify that. But certainly some very dramatic scenes captured in the Iranian capital last night. Meanwhile, other footage obtained by the Reuters news agency shows protesters gathering on a highway close to the prison in what is an apparent show of solidarity with those locked up inside. And as the protesters walk amongst the traffic along the roads leading to the facility, they can be heard chanting "Death to the Dictator," one of the main slogans of the recent anti-government protests that have rocked Iran, triggered, of course, by the death of Mahsa Amini, the young woman who died last month after being arrested by the regime's morality police. State media, meanwhile, says calm has been restored at Evin Prison. Indeed, it even broadcast footage of one of its reporters inside, showing firefighters inspecting the damage and also showing inmates back in their wards, apparently sound asleep. The authorities say 4 people were killed and 61 others injured in the fire. They say it wasn't linked to those recent protests. Rather, it was the result of a fight that broke out. But the fact that Evin Prison is known to house political prisoners, including hundreds of those involved in the recent nationwide protests, has led some to believe that this was more than just the result of a fight among petty criminals. Dominic Velitis, CBC News, London.
For more, let's turn now to Gisu Nia. She's a human rights lawyer and the director of the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project. Gisu, thanks so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
Gisu, part of the trouble in getting information out about Evin Prison is that we are so reliant on what the regime tells us. So far, they have said 4 people were killed in that riot and fire last night. Can we take that number at their word?
It's really hard to know. They initially said that 40 people had died, and then they revised the number to say 4. And the important thing to note is that we never get transparent accounting from the state about casualties when it comes to crackdowns on peaceful protests. We still don't know the exact number who were killed in violent crackdowns on peaceful protests in November 2019. So it's I would take that with a grain of salt. I do know that right now, a lot of human rights organizations and citizen journalist collectives are trying to track this and speak to all the folks that they have contact with to ensure that all of those people are safe and well. And so we've been verifying that one by one.
I've been seeing that on your Twitter account today, that you are posting images and messages both in English and in Farsi of individuals who may be held at Evin and that they haven't been heard from. So talk to me a bit about that. For those who don't know Evin Prison, how difficult is it to find out if your loved one is being held there, if they're alive or not?
So there is phone communication between prisoners and their families. Typically, obviously, it's very regulated and all of that. Also, there are other ways that we can get information from the prison. However, what had happened yesterday was that the phone lines were simply cut off. So families were absolutely in a panic. They all started driving towards the prison. And so there's video that folks can see of a very crowded and congested road towards Evin Prison with cars honking and basically demanding to pass through. All the roads had been blocked off at the time of the fire. And there was a lot of concern because there were videos showing what looked like explosions, projectiles heading towards the prison, and then large explosions with flashes of light, and also the sounds of gunfire. And because of the history with an incident called Cinema Rex, back in '78, when the same people that came to power, who now run the Islamic Republic, actually set a cinema on fire that resulted in 500 people being killed. The echoes of that really stick with Iranians. And so there was a deep concern that about the origins of this fire. And even if we don't know the origins, whether or not all these lawyers, activists, journalists, and these other lights and luminaries of Iranian society would actually be protected.
Talk to me about what happens to people inside Evin Prison.
Well, prisoner Ward 8, the Unit 8, is where all the political prisoners are kept. There are different wards. There's also a women's ward. And people like Nargis Mohammadi, a prominent Iranian human rights defender, is in there right now. Hossein Ronaghi, who's been a completely outspoken defender of human rights. Majid Tavakoli, somebody who's really a philosopher and just a longtime student activist and defender of human rights. All these people are in the prison. The prison is especially overcrowded at the moment because the Iranian authorities preemptively arrested lots of figures in civil society in an attempt to quell the ongoing protests in the country that are now in its fourth week. But basically what happens there is pretty dark. For those who may not know, these individuals are subjected to interrogation, often by intelligence agencies, whether that's the Ministry of Intelligence or the intelligence apparatus of the IRGC, the SEPA, and that involves psychological and physical torture. So we've documented hundreds and thousands of cases that show these repeated patterns of torture being used to obtain information from anybody who is perceived to be opposition, actual or perceived opposition. These are just people who are peacefully working on human rights and who are exercising their freedom of expression, and for that they pay a very heavy cost.
Again, the regime has told us that what happened at the prison, the fire, the gunshots, they were related to a riot within the prison and had nothing to do with the ongoing protests on the streets. What's your read of the situation?
I think the bottom line is that regardless of how the fire started, and I would definitely take any government accounting of how the fire started with a very big, like a boulder of salt. But regardless of that, I think this underscores how problematic it is that so many incredible human rights lawyers, journalists, activists, filmmakers, there's two globally acclaimed filmmakers, Jafar Panahi and Mohammad Rasulov, who were tear gassed in the fire yesterday because the authorities were tear gassing them. This underscores why none of these people should be in that prison at this moment, that they are wrongfully held there in contravention of international law, in contravention of the Islamic Republic of Iran's international obligations. They've signed on to conventions that they need to uphold. And this underscores why all these people need to be released immediately. The international community needs to be doing far more to urge the release of these prisoners. I should note that there are also dual national and foreign national hostages who are held at Evin. These are citizens of Belgium, France, the US. Immediate action needs to be taken to release these individuals. And the member states of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva should immediately be calling a special session to discuss this very urgent human rights crisis in Iran and to discuss the establishment of a UN investigative mechanism that will look at what is happening there, be able to properly document and hold the leadership accountable, whether that's in an international court or in Iran's own domestic courts one day when the judiciary is independent.
Gisu, quickly before I let you go, you mentioned the international community. Canada has issued new sanctions against members of the regime and the Revolutionary Guard. What do you make of the steps that Canada has taken so far?
Canada can be doing a lot more. So the Canadian government can be not only freezing the assets of individuals in its country that are linked to the IRI or that really are part of the Islamic Republic, they can also be seizing those assets and transferring them to victims of those crimes. Canada has the legislation to do that, and I'd like to see the Canadian government get serious about that and really use these assets to rehabilitate the victims and survivors of these crimes. They have the ability to do so. The Canadian government can also support the ICC submission, the submission to the International Criminal Court that the families of the victims of PS 752 made last month to the ICC Office of the Prosecutor. All these violations that are happening right now, so many of them are connected, and the perpetrators are common perpetrators for these different incidents. And so I think there's a lot more than I appreciate the steps that the Canadian government has taken. I think there's a lot more they can do to show that they are serious about supporting the people of Iran and supporting human rights in that country.
Gisu Nia, thank you so much for your time and for your insights.
Thank you for having me.